You are standing at the mouth of a cave in the mountains of Argos, and the smell hits you before the sound does. Rot. Sulfur. Something ancient and wrong. Then you hear it, not one hiss, but 9, overlapping, breathing in a rhythm that is almost like laughter. You take one step back. Too late. 9 heads rise out of the darkness at once, and you finally understand why the heroes who came before you never came back. This is the world of Greek monsters. Not the sanitized version you got in school, printed on the sides of juice boxes and cartoon posters. The real one, dripping, screaming, older than the gods themselves, born in an age before Olympus even had a throne room. Everyone knows Medusa. The gorgon with snakes for hair, the stare that turns flesh to stone. She has become mythology's mascot, printed on t-shirts, tattooed on shoulders, softened into something almost cute, almost marketable. But Medusa was never the worst thing lurking in the Greek imagination. Not even close. She was, in many ways, one of the more sympathetic monsters of her age, a victim of a god's cruelty, cursed for something that was never her fault. The creatures on this list tonight were not victims. They were forces. They were the physical shape of everything the Greeks could not explain, could not control, and could not survive without extraordinary help from the gods themselves. Today, you are going to meet 10 creatures that the ancient Greeks feared far more than her. 10 monsters born from betrayal, from divine punishment, from a darkness that existed before Zeus ever sat on his throne. Some of them you have heard of. Some of them, I promise you, you have not heard the full story of, because most retellings stop at the surface, the Wikipedia version, the summary that fits in a sentence. Tonight we are going all the way down, into the sources themselves, into Hesiod and Homer and Apollodorus, into the details that the ancient world actually wrote down and then quietly let modern culture forget. And at the very end, you are going to meet the one being so terrifying that even Zeus, king of all the gods, ran from it. There is one detail about that final monster that most retellings leave out entirely, a secret buried in Hesiod's original text that changes everything you think you know about the gods, about their power, and about what it actually means to be afraid. You will understand it only when we get there. So stay with me. This is a long descent. Get comfortable. Let's begin the countdown. Number 10, the Lernaean Hydra. Just the slow drip of water off cypress roots, and the low, wet sound of something breathing beneath the surface. The locals do not come here after dark. They have not for generations. There used to be a village nearby, or so the old stories go, and the village is simply gone now, swallowed into the marsh along with everyone who ever tried to farm too close to the water. Then the surface breaks, and a serpent's head the size of a horse rises up, and behind it, another. And another. 9 in total, in most tellings, though some ancient sources claimed as many as 50, a detail so overwhelming that later writers simply gave up trying to count and settled on a number that felt manageable to imagine. The Hydra was not simply a monster. It was a lesson in futility, carved into flesh and scale. Cut off one head, 2 grow back in its place, wet and glistening, already hissing before they have even finished forming. This was not exaggeration for the sake of drama. Ancient audiences understood the Hydra as something closer to a parable, a symbol of a problem that punishes you for trying to solve it the obvious way, for reaching for the sword before you understand what you are actually fighting. Hercules learned this the hard way during his second labor, one of 12 impossible tasks assigned to him as penance for a crime committed in a fit of madness sent by the goddess Hera, who despised him from the moment he was born, the product of one more of Zeus's countless affairs. Every strike of Hercules' sword only multiplied his enemy. He was not fighting a creature. He was fighting mathematics, and mathematics was winning, methodically, patiently, without malice, simply because that was the nature of the thing he faced. 2 heads became 4. 4 became 8. The swamp filled with the sound of hissing multiplying faster than a man could swing a blade, and for the first time in his life, Hercules understood that strength alone was not going to be enough. According to Hesiod's theogony, the Hydra was raised in the swamps of Lerna specifically to torment humanity, nursed on venom by the goddess Hera herself in her private grudge against Hercules, until its very breath could kill a man standing 20 paces away, before a blade had even touched him. Its blood was black and thick as tar, and it was not simply poisonous, it was corrosive, capable of dissolving flesh and bone on contact, a substance so lethal that even a single drop splashed onto skin could end a life within minutes. Even its footprints in the mud were said to be venomous, so that simply walking where the creature had walked was enough to kill. Hercules eventually solved the problem not with strength, but with fire, calling on his nephew Iolaus to cauterize each stump the instant a head was severed, burning the wound closed before new heads could regenerate from it. Head after head fell, and each one was sealed with a burning torch before it had the chance to become two again, until finally only the last head remained. But here is where it gets worse. That final head was immortal. Not merely tough, not merely resilient, genuinely, permanently immortal, incapable of dying by any means available to gods or men. Even after Hercules finally solved the multiplying heads problem, he still had no way to actually kill this last piece of the creature. So instead, he severed it anyway, and buried it, alive, still hissing, still aware, beneath a massive boulder on the road between Lerna and Elaeus, sealing it into the earth forever. Somewhere in Greece, in the ancient imagination, that head is still down there. Still breathing. Still waiting, in the dark, under stone, for a weight that will never lift. There is a reason the Hydra sits at the bottom of tonight's list rather than being dismissed as a minor obstacle. It represents something almost every human being has felt at some point, the exhausting, demoralizing sensation of trying to fix something and watching it get worse with every attempt. The Greeks did not fear the Hydra because it was fast, or clever, or cruel. They feared it because it made effort itself into a trap. Number 9. The Nemean Lion. Picture a lion the size of a small building, golden fur rippling in moonlight over a body built like something that should not exist in nature at all, except the fur is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what is underneath it. The Nemean lion's hide could not be pierced. Not by bronze, not by iron, not by any weapon forged by human hands, no matter how sharp, no matter how strong the arm that wielded it. Arrows bounced off its skin like pebbles thrown against a shield wall. Spears splintered on impact, the wood shattering while the beast simply turned its head to watch, almost bored by the attempt. This was not a wild animal that could be hunted in the ordinary sense, tracked and cornered by clever men with good aim. It was a living fortress with teeth, an engineering problem disguised as a beast, and the villages near Nemea did not simply fear losing livestock to it. They feared losing their sons, sent out one by one, generation after generation, to prove their courage against a creature that could not be wounded, only delayed, only avoided for one more night if the gods were feeling generous. Apollodorus describes the lion as a creature born from Typhon and Echidna themselves, two names you should remember because they are coming up soon, and because nearly every monster on this list traces back to that same terrible bloodline. In other tellings, the lion was not born at all in the ordinary sense, but dropped from the moon by the goddess Selene, a monster literally not of this earth, a piece of the night sky given claws and hunger and set loose among mortal men who had no framework for understanding what they were dealing with. Hercules discovered its invincibility the hard way, watching his own weapons fail against its hide again and again in the opening moments of their fight, arrow after arrow deflecting harmlessly into the underbrush, his sword bending rather than cutting when he finally closed the distance. And here is the detail that most people forget when they tell this story quickly. He did not win with strength alone, and he did not win with a clever trick or a borrowed weapon. He won by understanding the lion's own body, its own geometry, in a way that no one before him had bothered to consider. He drove the beast into a cave with two entrances, then deliberately sealed one shut with boulders, forcing a confrontation on his own terms rather than the lion's. Trapped in close quarters, with nowhere left to retreat and no room to maneuver around him, Hercules dropped his useless weapons entirely and strangled the creature with his bare hands, wrapping his forearm around its throat and holding on through the frenzied, useless clawing of a beast that had never once needed to fight for its life before. Afterward, in a detail almost too perfect for a myth, he skinned the lion using its own claws, the only blade in the entire world sharp enough to cut through its impenetrable hide, since no forged metal had ever managed it. He wore that skin as armor for the rest of his life, the lion's head serving as a helmet, its pelt as a cloak, turning the one creature no weapon could kill into the one thing that would protect him from every weapon after it. The psychological weight of that image mattered enormously to ancient audiences. the idea that the only way to defeat true invulnerability was to abandon your tools entirely and rely on nothing but your own body, your own will, pressed directly against the monster with no barrier between you at all. Number 8. Scylla. You are sailing a narrow strait, cliff so close on either side you could almost touch both walls of rock with your oars extended, the water below churning dark and cold even in daylight. Above you, on the cliff face, something is watching, tucked into a cave halfway up the rock that no sailor has ever climbed close enough to examine directly, because no sailor who tries ever comes back down to describe it. 6 heads, each on its own long, serpentine neck. 12 legs, each ending in claws that scrape against stone when she shifts her weight. A voice, Homer tells us in the Odyssey, no louder than a young puppy's, a detail almost designed to lower your guard right before she strikes, a small, almost pitiful sound rising from something that will devour 6 of your crewmen before you even understand what is happening. Scylla was once a beautiful sea nymph. That is the part of her story people forget, and it is also the part that makes her more disturbing, not less. She was transformed into a monster out of jealousy, not divine judgment or cosmic punishment, but simple, petty, personal spite. In one version of her origin, the sea god Glaucus fell in love with her and sought help from the sorceress Circe to win her affection. Circe, harboring her own feelings for Glaucus, poisoned the tidal pool where Scylla bathed instead, out of jealousy so consuming that she would rather ruin an innocent woman than see her win the affection of a man she wanted for herself. Scylla emerged from that poisoned water reborn as something with 6 ravenous heads circling one waterlogged, writhing lower body, each head able to snatch a sailor straight off the deck of a passing ship with terrifying precision, timed so that a captain steering wide to avoid one danger sailed directly into her reach without ever realizing the trade he had just made. Every time a ship passed beneath her cliff, she claimed exactly 6 lives, no more and no less, a horrifying, almost ritualistic consistency that made her presence entirely predictable and entirely unavoidable at the same time. Homer's Odyssey places her directly opposite an equally lethal threat, on the far side of a strait so narrow that avoiding one monster meant sailing directly into range of the other, which forced every sailor who passed through into an impossible choice with no version that ended painlessly. And that impossible choice brings us to our next monster, her constant counterpart, the other half of the most famous trap in all of ancient literature. Number 7. Charybdis. Directly across the strait from Scylla lived something that was not even shaped like a creature at all, which in many ways made her far more disturbing to the ancient imagination. Charybdis was once a nymph, daughter of Poseidon and Gaia, punished by Zeus for stealing land from Sicily on her father's behalf and flooding it into the sea, an act of theft on a monstrous, geological scale. As punishment, Zeus transformed her into a living whirlpool, a mouth of ocean itself, cursed to swallow the sea 3 times a day and spit it back out again, dragging entire ships down into her churning throat along with every soul aboard. Sailors caught between Scylla and Charybdis faced a decision with no right answer, no clever third option, no version of the story where everyone survives. Sail too close to Scylla, and lose 6 men to 6 mouths, a fixed and predictable toll. Sail too close to Charybdis, and lose the entire ship, and every soul aboard, in a single swallow, dragged down into a darkness from which nothing ever returned. This is where the phrase, between a rock and a hard place, was born in later usage, though the original Greek version was far more literal, and far more lethal, describing not a mere inconvenience but a genuine choice between partial loss and total annihilation. Odysseus himself was forced to make this choice in Book 12 of the Odyssey, weighing the certain deaths of 6 of his men against the potential deaths of everyone still on board. He chose to sail closer to Scylla, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it would cost, because losing 6 men was, in his calculating mind, not nearly as unthinkable as losing everyone he had left. He did not warn his crew of the specific danger, according to some interpretations, fearing they would abandon their oars in panic and doom the ship entirely. He simply steered toward the lesser horror and watched, silently, as 6 of his men were snatched screaming from the deck, their arms outstretched toward him in a final, desperate plea he could do nothing to answer. That decision haunted him for the rest of the voyage, a private grief he carried without ever fully explaining to the men who survived. It was not cowardice. It was not cruelty, either. It was the only kind of mathematics survival ever allows, and the ancient Greeks understood something profound in pairing these 2 monsters together on opposite sides of the same strait, that some of the worst horrors in life are not simply about facing danger, but about being forced to choose exactly how much you are willing to lose. Number 6. The Chimera. You round a bend in the mountains of Lycia and the air changes first, hot and sulfuric and wrong, the kind of smell that makes animals bolt and men freeze in place before their minds have even processed why. Then you see it. A lion's head at the front, roaring flame with every breath, the fire pouring out in a column hot enough to melt bronze at 30 paces. A goat's head growing directly out of its spine, mid-body, screaming in a register no goat should ever reach, high and grating and constant, led over the lion's roar like two instruments playing entirely different, discordant songs at once. And where a tail should be, a serpent, hissing, striking at anything that gets too close from behind, so that even approaching the creature from what should be its blind side offered no safety at all. In Greek, the word chimera simply meant she-goat, a strangely mundane origin for a name that would eventually become synonymous with any unnatural, impossible hybrid. By the time Homer used it in the Iliad, describing her as a thing of immortal make, not human, lion-fronted and snake behind, a goat in the middle, the word had already become shorthand for something monstrous and unnatural, three creatures forced into one body that should never have existed, a violation of the natural order simply by being alive at all. The Chimera was said to be the daughter of Typhon and Echidna, born in the depths of Lycia and raised specifically to terrorize the region, and she did so with a viciousness that left entire villages reduced to ash and bone. Homer describes her breathing raging fire, burning crops, homes, and livestock in sweeping arcs that left the land scorched for years afterward, a creature whose mere presence in a region meant famine and death regardless of how many people she directly killed. What made the Chimera so uniquely dangerous was not brute strength, or even the fire itself, but the fact that she attacked from three directions simultaneously, with no single vulnerable angle. Face her lion head directly, and you risk incineration. Try to flank her, and the goat head, positioned exactly where a warrior would expect to find a blind spot, screams a warning that lets the serpent tail strike your back before you have even registered the danger. There was no single angle of approach that kept you safe from all three at once, no clever positioning that neutralized more than one threat at a time, which meant that fighting her conventionally was, for most warriors, a slow and certain death sentence delivered from multiple directions at once. The hero Bellerophon eventually defeated her, but only with help that no ordinary mortal could have accessed alone. Riding the winged horse Pegasus, born from the blood of Medusa herself after her death at Perseus's hands, Bellerophon attacked from the one direction the Chimera could never defend, straight up, out of the sky, where none of her three heads could reach him at all. According to Apollodorus, he did not simply strike her from above with a spear. He fitted his weapon with a block of lead, and as the lion's head roared flame directly upward at him, the fire melted the lead mid-air, sending it pouring down the creature's own throat, where it cooled and hardened inside her, killing her from within with her own weapon turned against her. It remains one of the most darkly poetic deaths in all of Greek mythology, a fire-breathing monster ultimately killed by molten metal she herself was tricked into melting. Number 5. The Sphinx. This one is different from the rest, and in many ways more disturbing precisely because of that difference. The Sphinx did not hunt you with claws or fire or venom. She hunted you with words, with logic, with the terrifying possibility that your own mind might simply not be sharp enough to save your life. Perched on a cliff outside Thebes, with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face and chest of a woman, a combination the Greeks found deeply unsettling precisely because it blended the beautiful and the monstrous into a single form, the Sphinx stopped every single traveler who tried to pass and asked them one riddle, always the same riddle, delivered in a calm, almost musical voice that gave no hint of the violence that would follow a wrong answer. Answer correctly, and you may live, and pass, unharmed. Answer incorrectly, and she strangles you where you stand with her powerful lion's body, then devours you whole, bones and all, leaving nothing behind for your family to bury or mourn over. For years, no one answered correctly. Bodies piled at the base of that cliff, a graveyard built entirely from wrong guesses, from confident young men who thought themselves clever enough and were proven wrong in the last few seconds of their lives. This was psychological terror in its purest ancient form, a horror that could not be avoided through strength or speed or weaponry, because the entire test took place inside your own skull, where no sword could help you and no shield could block a single wrong syllable. She was not simply a monster you could outrun or outfight. She was one you had to outthink, while she watched you struggle, again and again, with something disturbingly close to genuine amusement, as though the entire arrangement was, to her, an elaborate and endlessly entertaining game. Here is what almost nobody talks about when this story gets told quickly. The Sphinx was sent to Thebes specifically as a punishment from the gods, most commonly Hera, as retribution for a crime committed generations earlier by the city's royal line, a curse laid not on one guilty man but on an entire population who had to bear the consequences of a sin they had no part in. She was not simply hunting individuals for sport. She was an instrument of collective divine punishment, a plague with a human face and a riddle instead of a disease, and every traveler who died at her cliff was, in a very real sense, paying off a debt they never personally owed, victims of a justice system that did not distinguish between the guilty and the merely unlucky. It was Oedipus who finally solved her riddle, arriving at Thebes as an outsider with no knowledge of the curse he was walking into, only the simple ambition to pass through the city on his way to a destiny he did not yet understand. The riddle asked what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening. The answer, which had defeated every mind that came before his, was man himself, crawling on all 4s as an infant, walking upright through the years of adulthood, and finally leaning on a cane in old age. It was an answer about the entire arc of a human life, compressed into a single riddle, and the moment it was finally spoken aloud correctly, something in the Sphinx seemed to break entirely. According to some versions of the myth, she did not simply accept defeat quietly. She threw herself from the cliff in despair, unable to bear the reality that her one purpose, her one source of power, had finally been undone, as though the riddle itself was the only thing holding her together, and losing it meant she no longer had any reason to exist at all. Number 4. Cerberus. Now we descend. Past the river Styx, past the ferryman Charon collecting his coin from the mouths of the dead, into the underworld itself, where a single guardian stands between the living and the land from which nothing returns. 3 heads, each with jaws capable of crushing bone in a single bite. A mane made not of hair but of writhing, hissing serpents, constantly moving even when the rest of the beast is still. A tail that ends not in fur or bone, but in the head of a dragon, its own separate mouth, its own separate hunger. This is Cerberus, and his job is simple, absolute, and unbreakable. Nothing that enters the underworld is ever permitted to leave. Hesiod describes him in the Theogony as monstrous, irresistible, a creature that fawns with his tail and both ears on those entering the realm of the dead, greeting new arrivals almost gently, almost warmly, in a detail that makes him far more unsettling rather than less. But the moment you try to walk back out, cross the threshold in the wrong direction, he becomes something else entirely, something savage and unforgiving, devouring anyone who attempts to escape the realm of the dead without the express permission of its rulers. He is not simply violent. He is selectively violent, gentle to the dying and merciless to the living, a creature whose behavior toward you depends entirely on which direction you are moving through his domain. Only a handful of heroes in all of Greek mythology ever got past him and lived to describe the experience. Orpheus charmed him with music alone, his lyre so beautiful and his grief so genuine, mourning his dead wife Eurydice, that even a 3-headed hound bred specifically to resist all mercy fell asleep listening to it, all 3 heads drooping in unison as the song wound its way down into the deepest parts of the underworld. Hercules, for his final and most impossible labor, the 12th and last task assigned to him by King Eurystheus, descended into the underworld itself and wrestled Cerberus with his bare hands, refusing any weapon, matching brute strength against brute strength until the beast finally submitted. He dragged Cerberus, still snarling, still hissing from every serpent head woven into his mane, up into the world of the living, proving in the most literal way imaginable that he had conquered even death's own gatekeeper, before returning the beast safely to his post, because even Hercules understood that some guardians could be borrowed but never permanently removed. Here is the detail that matters most, though, the one that separates Cerberus from every other monster on this list so far. Cerberus was never evil. He held no personal hatred for humanity, harbored no grudge, sought no revenge for some ancient wrong. He was doing exactly what he was created to do, faithfully, eternally, without complaint or cruelty beyond what his function required. He is, in many ways, the most honest monster on this entire list, a being with one single unbreakable purpose, guarding a boundary that mortals were never meant to cross twice, and there is something almost tragic in the idea of a creature whose entire existence is defined by standing eternally at a doorway, watching countless souls pass through in one direction only, forever. Number 3, the Erinyes, the Furies. If Cerberus guards the border of death, the Erinyes punish the crimes that death itself cannot forgive, hunting the living long before they ever reach his gate. Born from the blood of Uranus when his own son Cronus mutilated him in one of the earliest and most violent acts in the entire Greek cosmology, a betrayal so foundational that it essentially set the pattern for every family tragedy that followed in Greek myth, the Erinyes emerged from droplets of divine blood that fell upon the earth, born not through ordinary birth but through an act of primal violence between father and son. The three sisters, most commonly named Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone, have hair made of living snakes, wings like a bat stretched taut and leathery, and eyes that weep blood instead of tears, a detail ancient sources describe with a matter-of-factness that makes it somehow more disturbing than if it had been dramatized. Their sole purpose in existence is to hunt down and torment anyone who commits crimes against blood family, matricide, patricide, the betrayal and murder of one's own kin, crimes the ancient Greeks considered so fundamentally unnatural that ordinary human justice was not sufficient to address them. They do not simply kill their targets. That would almost be a mercy, a quick and clean resolution. Instead, they drive the guilty mad, following them relentlessly across land and sea, whispering accusations only the guilty party can hear, screaming in the dead of night, never resting, never tiring, until the criminal either descends into total madness or dies from the sheer psychological weight of being hunted by justice itself, embodied, given wings and claws and an appetite for suffering rather than blood. Orestes, who killed his own mother Clytemnestra to avenge the murder of his father Agamemnon, was pursued by the Erinyes for what felt like an eternity in Aeschylus's dramatic retelling, tormented nearly to death, driven from city to city, unable to find rest or shelter anywhere in the Greek world, because the Erinyes recognized no borders and respected no sanctuary. It was not until the goddess Athena finally intervened, establishing a formal court of law, the Areopagus, to judge his case through reasoned argument rather than endless supernatural torment, that his suffering was finally allowed to end, a moment ancient audiences understood as the mythological birth of civilized justice itself, replacing the older, wilder cycle of endless blood vengeance. It was not simple revenge, and it was not simple punishment, either. It was not simple justice, in the way we might use that word casually today. It was all three at once, fused into three sisters who represented something even the Olympian gods were careful never to interfere with directly, something older and more fundamental than the rule of Zeus. Even Zeus respected their authority and their independence, because the Erinyes predated him, born from Uranus generations before Zeus ever overthrew his own father Cronus in turn. They answer to an older, deeper law than Olympus itself, a law about blood and family and betrayal that existed before there were gods organized enough to enforce anything at all. Number 2, Echidna, mother of all monsters. Now we reach the source, the root from which nearly everything on this list eventually grows. Half woman, half serpent, described by Hesiod as beautiful above the waist, with bright eyes and lovely cheeks, and horrifying below it, a massive, coiling serpent's tail spotted and terrible, Echidna lived hidden in a cave in the depths of Arcadia, rarely seen by mortal eyes, rarely spoken of directly even in the myths that owe their existence to her. And yet she is responsible, directly or indirectly, for nearly every monster you have heard about tonight. Hesiod calls her outright the mother of monsters, a monster more fell than they, unlike either to mortal men or to the undying gods, and the list of her children, born from her union with the equally monstrous Typhon, reads like a roll call of nightmares assembled specifically to terrorize humanity for generation after generation. The Hydra, hissing in its swamp. The Chimera, breathing fire across Lycia. The Nemean lion, in several ancient tellings, though other sources place his birth elsewhere. Cerberus himself, guarding the gates of the dead. Even the Sphinx, perched on her cliff outside Thebes with her impossible riddle. Nearly every terrifying creature you have heard about tonight traces its bloodline directly back to this one hidden mother, coupled with a father even more monstrous than she was, a father we have been building toward this entire countdown. Echidna herself was rarely hunted or confronted directly in surviving myth, which is itself telling. She was less a monster to be fought and more a monster to be feared abstractly, a source, an origin point, something that existed in the deep background of Greek cosmology, the way a queen might remain hidden in a fortress while sending out army after army to do her fighting for her. Ancient sources describe her as ageless and immortal, unlike her children, who could be killed, wounded, tricked, or defeated by clever and determined heroes. Echidna herself, tucked away in her cave, simply continued producing horror after horror for the world above to contend with, a factory of nightmares operating in near-total darkness. And that brings us, finally, to him. To the Father. To the single most terrifying entity in the entire Greek cosmological system, a being so powerful that his name alone was said to unsettle even the gods who eventually defeated him. Number 1, Typhon. Here is the secret I promised you at the very beginning. The one detail most retellings leave out entirely, because it complicates everything you think you understand about the power structure of Olympus. Hesiod describes Typhon in the Theogony as a being so massive that his head scraped the stars themselves, with 100 serpent heads growing from his shoulders, each one screaming a different sound at once, the roar of a lion, the hiss of a snake, the bellow of a bull, the bark of a dog, all layered together in a single, impossible, overwhelming chorus that could apparently be heard across entire mountain ranges. Fire poured from his eyes in continuous streams. His hand stretched from one horizon to the other, so vast that he could grasp mountains in either fist. He was not simply the strongest monster in Greek mythology. He was the physical embodiment of chaos itself, born from Gaia, the earth, and Tartarus, the primordial pit beneath the underworld, specifically to challenge Zeus for control of the entire cosmos, an act of vengeance from the earth herself after Zeus's defeat of the earlier generation of gods known as the Titans. And here is the part that changes everything, the detail almost never mentioned in modern retellings because it complicates the image of the all-powerful, unshakable Olympian gods. When Typhon rose up and attacked Olympus, the gods did not stand their ground and fight. They ran. Every single one of them, including Zeus himself, fled all the way to Egypt and transformed themselves into animals specifically to hide from him, disguising their divine identities entirely out of pure terror. Apollo became a hawk. Hermes transformed into an ibis. Even Ars, the god of war himself, the deity whose entire domain was violence and combat, turned himself into a fish and swam away rather than face what was coming across the sky toward Olympus. This detail survives directly in ancient sources, described without embarrassment or apology, and it is almost never mentioned in modern retellings, precisely because it complicates the image of the all-powerful Olympian gods that popular culture prefers to present. It was not weakness on their part, and it was not simple cowardice, either. It was pure, unfiltered terror, the kind that overrides rank and pride and divine dignity all at once, because for one single moment in the history of the cosmos, the gods of Olympus were not the strongest beings in existence. Typhon was. And every one of them knew it instantly, the moment he rose from Tartarus and began his ascent toward their throne room. Zeus alone eventually turned back to face him, after the others had scattered across Egypt in their borrowed animal forms, and their battle was the single most violent confrontation in all of Greek mythology, described across multiple ancient sources with genuinely apocalyptic imagery, mountains crumbling, seas boiling, the sky itself catching fire from the force of their combined power colliding again and again. Typhon actually won the first exchange decisively, wrapping his coils around Zeus and tearing the sinews from his hands and feet, the tendons that gave the king of the gods the ability to move, to throw his thunderbolts, to fight at all. Zeus was left utterly helpless, unable to lift a finger, hidden away in the Carytian cave while Typhon's own monstrous offspring, the same Hydra, the same Chimera, the same monsters you have already heard about tonight, guarded him as a prisoner in his own mountain range. It took the god Hermes, working in secret alongside the god Pan, to steal back Zeus's stolen sinews from where Typhon had hidden them, guarded by a dragon named Delphine, and restore his power piece by piece, tendon by tendon, in a rescue mission that unfolded entirely outside the awareness of the monster who believed his victory was already complete and permanent. Only then, restored and furious, did Zeus return to the battlefield with his thunderbolts blazing, and finally drive Typhon down through the earth itself, burying him underneath Mount Etna in Sicily, where, according to legend, he still writhes today, pinned beneath the weight of an entire mountain, unable to fully die because he was never entirely mortal in the first place. Every eruption of that volcano, every tremor felt across the Sicilian countryside, is described in ancient sources as Typhon's rage, still leaking out from underneath a mountain, thousands of years later, a reminder that chaos was defeated but never destroyed, only contained. This is the psychological core of the entire myth, the reason Typhon earns the top spot on tonight's list above every other creature we have discussed. Typhon represents something every human being understands instinctively, whether or not they have ever read a word of Hesiod. The fear that chaos can, for one terrifying moment, overpower even the most ordered systems we build to protect ourselves, that the structures we trust most completely, the ones we assume are permanent and unshakable, can be brought to the very edge of collapse by something we did not see coming and cannot fully control. The gods of Olympus were supposed to be the architecture of order in the universe, the final answer to every question of power and authority. And for one single, genuinely uncertain night, that architecture nearly collapsed entirely, and every god on the mountain knew it, and ran. So here are your 3 takeaways. First, on myth, nearly every monster you fear in Greek mythology descends from a single source, Echidna and Typhon, chaos given form, given children, given teeth and claws and fire, and sent out into the world one horrifying offspring at a time. Second, on psychology, the Greeks did not invent these monsters randomly, out of idle imagination. Each one represents a specific human fear, refined and sharpened over generations of storytelling. The Hydra represents problems that punish easy solutions and multiply the harder you fight them directly. The Sphinx represents the terror of being tested with no room for error. The Erinyes represent the guilt that never lets go, that follows you long after the crime itself is finished. Third, and this is the warning worth carrying with you after tonight, even the gods, even Zeus himself, was once powerless, once stripped of his sinews and left helpless in a cave while his enemies celebrated too early. Chaos does not care how strong you believe yourself to be, how secure your position seems, how permanent your order feels. It only asks whether you were ready for the one night everything you built might not be enough. Now I want to know from you. Out of these 10 monsters, which one do you think you could have actually survived? Not defeated, not outwitted permanently, simply survived, for one night, in one encounter. Put your answer in the comments, and I will read every single one. If this kind of story pulls you in, subscribe, because there are darker gods and older monsters still waiting in the depths of this mythology, and I am not done pulling them into the light.